I've heard the presentation already, and I was going to do this introduction, but they cover everything I was going to say, so I'm going to turn it over to Josh and Victoria, and also I'd like to recognize Chelsea and Andy, who are part of the team.
Hi guys.
There's been about over the just year and a half so far that we started this, maybe 15 or 20 other students that have been involved in this project, which they're going to describe to you thoroughly. So we're at Virginia Commonwealth University.
So thank you for joining us here today. We couldn't be more excited to be here with you here at Division 32. I'm Josh Keene.
And I'm Victoria Barnsler, and as he just said, we are students under we're students at Virginia Commonwealth University.
And for over a year now, we've been running a small undergraduate archival research internship under Dr. Bargill's tutelage, and today we're here to tell you a bit about what we do.
For the past 18 months, we've conducted research into the lives, struggles, and deaths of eco-martyrs. For our intents and purposes, an eco-martyr is a person who has died while defending the environment. We have a list of roughly 1,600 eco-martyrs from the Global Witness organization, dating back to 2002, from all over the world. Our research has taught us about people struggling to defend their homes, their resources, and their environment.
So from indigenous people killed in Brazil defending their land to journalists and researchers in India who are assassinated trying to expose corporate malpractice that destroys the environment, we research these people and we try to figure out who they were, what they were doing, how they were killed, and try to find ways to commemorate and memorialize their sacrifices.
And over the course of learning these heartbreaking stories, we found ourselves wondering, what exactly is it that sets these eco-martyrs apart from regular, everyday people? What is it that drives these people, and what common traits do they share? And so, examining these people from a humanistic lens, we've come to the conclusion that we are seeing traits of self-actualization.
So today what we're going to do is we're going to share some of the stories of our eco-martyrs, and we're going to talk about how they meet the different characteristics of self-actualization. And we're going to discuss about how this impacts humanistic psychology and our understanding of self-actualization right now. So we're all mostly familiar, I'm sure we're all familiar with the Maslow definition of self-actualization at the top of the hierarchy of needs, but the term actually comes from Kurt Goldstein in his 1939 book, The Organism. For a bit of background, Goldstein was a neuropsychiatrist in Nazi Germany who escaped to America, who felt that his work on the brain gave him insight into self-actualization. So to talk about what Goldstein means by self-actualization, we first have to kind of get at what Goldstein means when he's talking about the self. He uses this term not to as basically the agency one is given throughout life, like the ability to make choices, not necessarily like a bodily biological function, but as the soul, so to speak. But he also acknowledges that biological life and the idea of a self, they're not totally separate either. They rely on one another. Others have used the comparison of how a genotype and a phenotype are separate and distinct from one another, but they exist in the same place at the same time regardless. So that kind of definition of a self in mind, we can come up with, there's basically three aspects of Kurt Goldstein's view of self-actualization that differentiate it from other views. And first of those is the idea of invariance, which is self-actualization is not just a trait native to humans, but to all life, anything with a self. The second is holism, which is that self-actualization requires meaningful interaction with your environment. Just as how a Gestalt image cannot be properly viewed as just a series of parts, you can't view an organism outside of the context in which it exists. And the third is the idea of a soul driving force, and self-motivation being the actual only true motivation in this world. So it isn't necessarily an ascended state of being the way that Maslow describes it, but more of a process that all life is taking part in at all times.
And as he said, the term self-actualization originally comes from Kurt Goldstein, but most of us know it from Maslow's definition. And Maslow was an American psychologist who theorized a hierarchy of needs. He outlined his theory through a multi-tiered pyramid, as we can see here. And the needs he described are deficiency motivated, meaning people are working towards attaining these to fulfill all the tiers of the pyramid. And as we can see, the base of the pyramid are one's physiological needs, including air, water, food, shelter, and etc. If you can meet those, you get up to the safety needs, which are personal security, employment, resources, health, and property. Then you get to love and belonging, friendship, intimacy, family, and sense of connection. You meet those, you get to your self-esteem needs, respect, status, recognition, and freedom. If you can meet all of those, you get to be self-actualized, which is when you don't have really anything else to worry about other than pursuing yourself and helping your environment. And while Maslow describes self-actualization, he also describes several characteristics of a self-actualized individual. And it's worth pointing out that Maslow didn't specify that a self-actualized individual had to have all of the characteristics he described. And we're going to be describing these characteristics through the rest of our talk with y'all, and showing how the eco-marketers we've been studying for the past year and a half meet those characteristics.
So from here, what we'd like to spend some time doing is sharing the stories of our eco-martyrs and focusing on who they were, how they were killed, and how this relates to the Maslow hierarchy of needs, as well as how their sacrifices have helped their communities self-actualize and indeed the planet self-actualize. So.
And we hope that by sharing these stories, we'll show how these individuals have utilized their self-actualized characteristics to defend the environment.
So the first one of our eco-martyrs we want to share the story of is Timothy Lencio-Arig, who we feel exemplifies the characteristic of self-actualization known as human kinship. Maslow thought that one of the common traits of self-actualized people was an intense identifying with mankind and a real desire to see mankind prosper. Self-actualized people, they find other people easy to sympathize with and easy to connect with. And we feel that Timothy Lencio-Arig greatly exemplifies this characteristic. So Chieftain Arig, for a bit of background, was a chieftain of the Tuareg people in the Philippines. And he spent his life advocating for the rights of his community's rights for the land that they lived on, which is currently being, which he would fight against the legal development projects, here meaning land grabs that would destroy their natural resources. He would organize community marches, nonprofit organizations, and just general ways to resist the destruction of their land. And his adversaries would often refer to him as quoted as one of the most outspoken tribal leaders against mining exploration in the area. His friends close to him referred to him as having a friendly disposition, saying he was a skilled negotiator who always went out of his way to avoid conflict. He was killed on October 2nd, 2014, after attending a family wedding. People say that he had been very happy that day, happy to see all of his children together and all the people he loved. And he was walking home from this wedding and was shot to death. And the only evidence at the scene of the crime were some assault rifle bullet casings and his body described as riddled with violence from the knees to the neck. So examining Chieftain Timothy Arig's lifetime of service, we feel that he exemplifies these same traits of self-actualization, particularly in his identification with mankind that Maslow describes in his hierarchy of needs. His dedication to nonviolent community organizing and trying to save and benefit as many indigenous people as he could in his area, dedication that he ultimately paid for with his life, is indicative of the closeness to mankind that Maslow viewed as self-actualized.
And when Maslow characterizes a self-actualized individual as realistically oriented, he means the individual has the ability to see people for who they are, see through lies, and assess humanity realistically. And this is important because the constant perception of reality allows self-actualized individuals to understand the truth of human nature. And this is a trait we believe to have found in Keith Davis. Keith Davis was a marine biologist assigned to a Panamanian fishing vessel that was stationed off the coast of Peru. Davis, a fishing boat observer, had a unique line of work. Instead of being a fisherman, he was an observer for the vessel, meaning that Davis was accountable for ensuring all the rules, regulations, and laws were adhered to by fishermen while going about their daily routine. Though this may seem routine, this can be dangerous activity when you're facing up against fishermen who have a certain modus operandi that may conflict with the rules that Davis was enforcing. And on September 10th, Keith Davis was reported missing from the ship. An investigation into his disappearance was inconclusive. He's still considered missing, though those who have known him have presumed him dead. And we believe Davis showed signs of a realistically oriented, self-actualized individual. He worked to protect the oceans by enforcing the regulations toward safe and sustainable fishing practices. Davis understood the limitations surrounding ocean conservation and wanted to direct his efforts toward ensuring that fisheries were compliant. And this line of work is well suited for an individual who is realistically oriented. Being on a fishing vessel without a lot of oversight, there's potential for the workers to disregard the regulations. There's also high levels of disdain for the observers, as the crew often feel that the enforcement of tracking regulations is counterintuitive to the way that they should be doing their job. All of this requires an observer to see through lies and figure out what the truth is to make sure he was doing everything he could to further ocean conservation. And though he most likely paid the ultimate price with his life, his legacy lives on in the hearts and minds of those who knew, cared for, and loved him, along with members of the scientific community who remember his legacy as a man who was drawn to the sea and worked within his means to make it a better place.
So another sign of self-actualization is a great deal of humility and respect, characterized by a democratic mindset. And we feel it's important to clarify here that democratic mindset doesn't refer to any sort of like liberal politics or any real political ideology. Maslow is talking about an implicit desire to see all people represented and to make sure that all people have a voice they can use in their community. One trait that he felt characteristic of self-actualization was the ability to find it possible to learn from anyone that has something to impart. And we feel that this is the case of Mr. Hermé Allegre. Mr. Allegre, 32, was the president of the Parent-Teacher Community Association for LUMAD Children. The school where Mr. Allegre volunteered is a nonprofit community center for indigenous LUMAD children, who are a group of indigenous people living in the Philippines. These communities are built in some of the most fertile areas, resource-wise, in the Philippines, but in spite of this, the LUMAD people are some of the most economically disadvantaged in the country due to how their land is being colonized for its resources. Hermé Allegre was killed on the 15th of July in 2016. He was returning home from a meeting with the National Committee of Indigenous Peoples with his friend Chieftain Danny Durog when several men on motorcycles rode by and shot him to death. Mr. Durog survived. His father was another eco-martyr who had been killed in 2008, but Mr. Allegre passed away before help could be reached. One of his friends commented, "Attacks such as this threaten the rights of LUMAD children to an education and to a peaceful life. LUMAD school and community leaders being targeted by the military and paramilitaries and private armies mean that the indigenous learning and the LUMAD way of life is also under attack." So Mr. Hermé Allegre's dedication to helping organize and educate the LUMAD people is indicative of the same sort of democratic attitudes that Maslow discusses in his work. The work he did in his short life, making sure that everyone was able to educate themselves and use their voice in their community, we view as evidence that Mr. Allegre was self-actualized.
Another one of the traits in regard to Maslow's definition of self-actualization is acceptance of themselves and others in the natural world for what it is. And this trait is exemplified by a lack of anxiety of things outside of their control. And an individual we have found during our research we feel exemplifies this trait is Mario Guevara, a man who lived and loved the land for what it is, understood the dichotomy between good and evil, and wanted to preserve what he could of Honduran jungles. Throughout Honduras, gangs of illegal loggers flocked to the poorly documented areas of the Tuaca Reserve. These loggers often use these poorly protected rainforests for their exploits, playing a risky game of cat and mouse with Honduran government officials who are trying to preserve the land and indigenous people and harming the indigenous peoples who have used the land for generations. In September 2007, the government calls upon Mario Guevara, a man who knew the jungles of Honduras like the back of his hand and could aid the government in tracking the illegal logging. Mario Guevara was known to travel the Honduran rainforests and countrysides with nothing but the clothes on his back, a machete, and a .357 revolver. He also had an old beaten-up guitar, which he would also break out for sing-alongs around the campfire. And this fantastical description was exacerbated by his knowledge of the land and the people. He spoke numerous indigenous languages and is widely known by tribe leaders to be a friend. He could track, hunt, and identify plants for food and medicine. All these special skills made Gafaro uniquely qualified to handle the issue of illegal logging, but he was also a high-profile target for those with financial interests connected to the land he was trying to save. And a plan called for Gafaro to go into the forest with the team and mark a logging-free zone in the heart of the forest and arm indigenous peoples with GPS trackers for them to report illegal logging. To combat the death threats, they found safety in numbers, and along with a company of soldiers supplied by the Honduran government to protect their investment, they felt secure enough to begin their journey. On September 15, 2007, the group's efforts were cut short when Gafaro decided to break off from the others, accompanied just by his son, Shamir, to talk to indigenous groups that they were about to disperse GPS trackers to. On his walk downriver to a village, Gafaro was killed by men disguised as Honduran soldiers who shot Gafaro as his son ran for cover and ultimately survived the attack. The tragedy was not unexpected due to the death threats, and Gafaro understood the dangers that he was subjecting himself to. He understood the realities of the human condition, but sought to overcome them for the greater good. And Gafaro's understanding of the threats he had received and his willingness to continue on with the mission despite them is representative of an individual who has accepted the world for what it is and does not have large anxieties. Though he cared deeply for his environment and the people who live within it, he was not overcome with anxieties of things he could not control, such as the individual who wanted to stop his efforts.
So, another characteristic of these self-actualized people are their deep and profound interpersonal connections. And as we've noted elsewhere, self-actualized people draw a profound amount of energy from those around them, particularly in the form of these deep spiritual connections they make with their loved ones. And they understand that their loved ones aren't perfect, but it's still they gather a great wealth of inspiration and energy from them. We feel that this is the case in the case of Isidro Baldenegro Lopez. Isidro was only a child when he saw his father killed when he witnessed the death of his father, Julio Baldenegro Peña, at the hands of assassins employed by logging corporations. Julio had been taking a stand against the pillaging of the Sierra Madre's native resources and was killed for it. So upon entering adulthood, Isidro entered into environmental activism himself, and over the course of his life, he organized community protests, non-governmental organizations, all dedicated to combating illegal logging and deforestation, and even getting the government to briefly ban illegal logging in 2003. And he was punished greatly for his actions. He was arrested several times, received a lot of death threats, and was even imprisoned unjustly for long stints of time. But in spite of this, he continued his work, quoted as saying, "We know there are people out there who want to pillage the riches of the Sierra, and they don't even live here. And by fraud and forgery, we get away with it. And we oppose this. We are not going to let them log this forest anymore." And in 2005, his work was recognized when he was awarded the Goldman Award, which is a prestigious award for local grassroots environmentalists. And on stage, he accepted it in the name of his father. He said, "I am proud to receive this prize in the name of my community, my family, and of my late father, Julio Baldenegro Peña, who gave his life to defend the forests and from whom I inherited the struggle and the knowledge of how to support our people." Isidro Baldenegro Lopez was killed on January 16th, 2017 in his home. Witnesses say that someone outside called his name late at night. He walked outside and was shot 6 times by a young man who then fled into the night. And no one was ever charged with it. So Isidro's life was spent in service to the world around him, much the same as his father's was. And we feel that this profound connection between the two of them is indicative of the type of deep, loving, intimate, interpersonal relationships that Maslow thought characteristic of a self-actualized person.
And Maslow specifies that a self-actualized individual will have a great deal of spontaneity. And this may seem odd. How is being spontaneous a sign of self-actualization? Well, according to Maslow, spontaneity is displayed by unconventional behavior, not for superficial purposes, but to actively help the world around them. Jules Kombi-Kumbale, a fallen ranger for the Congolese Institute for the Conservation of Nature, displayed this while defending the Virunga National Park in the Democratic Republic of Congo. While on patrol in the Virunga National Park on October 27, 2016, Jules Combe Kambale was shot and killed as he tried to warn other rangers who were on patrol with him of the militia that was illegally mining charcoal. And before he was able to alert his brethren, he was shot down by the miners. He left behind his wife, who was 4 months pregnant at the time of his death. He's remembered as a fervent defender of the wildlife, especially for the gorillas who faced increased levels of poaching in the region. And we believe that Kambale exemplifies the idea of spontaneity due to the fact that instead of running for cover, attacking the militants, or taking bribes, he tried to rush to warn the other rangers. This shows that he was willing to help the world by acting against these militants and acted in an altruistic manner to warn his brothers and alert them of the potential danger.
Another characteristic that Maslow thought evident of self-actualization is a pragmatic application of ethics. Maslow thought that the self-actualized were concerned with the impact that they were having on the world more than most. And while it's very common for people to worry about their legacy and what they'll leave behind, Maslow thought that the self-actualized were particularly concerned with making sure that they leave the world in a better state than they found it. And of course, almost any of our slain defenders could meet this criteria, but one person who we feel is truly fitting the profile was young Cesar Medina Aguilar. Cesar was a 17-year-old student who lived in the Cajamarca region of Peru, and he was famed for being a very active student and student activist, serving as his school's student mayor. And so the Cajamarca region is part of the Amazon rainforest and is a large target for illegal mining. These mining operations are heavily protested by the people of the Cajamarca region, stating that it destroys their lands and their environment and their ability to live in the area. And one of these protests was responded to by President Ollanta Humala by sending in armed guards to disperse the protests. This resulted in a massacre where 5 people were killed, including young Cesar Medina Aguilar. Cesar Aguilar lives on now as a martyr for resistance and as a local hero. Every year on the 3rd and 4th of July, the people of the Cajamarca region honor his memory. The day of his death and those who were killed with him is treated as a local holiday, known as Dia de la Resistencia y la Dignidad de los Pueblos, or Day of the Resistance and Dignity of the People. Since Cesar was willing to give his life in the protest of the destruction of his environment and his community, we feel that he is exemplary of the sort of ethical concerns that are the trademark of the self-actualized. The sacrifice of one's life in the hopes of making the world a better place is the exact sort of concern with ethics that Maslow thought to be a trait of self-actualization.
Luis Alberto Araujo was a dedicated public servant in Brazil. He was the head of the Altamira Municipal Government's Environmental Department in the state of Pará, until he was fatally shot and killed on October 13th, 2016. Prior to his death, he had been providing information about illegal logging orchestrated by Antonio Fijo to the federal police and Brazil's federal public ministry in an attempt to stop the illegal activities. We believe that Araujo is an example of the problem-centered individual when it pertains to Maslow's definition of self-actualization. Brazil is the most dangerous place for environmentalists, as cartels that operate off the natural resources are not keen to lose profits due to government interference. Araujo was aware of the risks that he took when working to take down this group of loggers, and he worked in a governmentally legitimate manner that he believed would help this problem. Araujo's actions are indicative of someone who is problem-centered rather than self-centered. While he understood the dangers of being a relatively high-profile public servant working against these dangerous cartels, he also understood that he could use his position in the government for good. He could have just gone to work, collected his paycheck, and acted better himself. Instead, he worked to preserve Brazil's natural resources and paid the ultimate price for his efforts. He was not in vain either. Antonio Fijo was arrested along with his wife and brought to justice.
Another characteristic of the self-actualized is that they do not confuse means with ends. The self-actualized have the view of ends being of means being subordinate to ends, or put another way, they are more concerned with the result of an action than with the action itself. Maslow thought that the self-actualized were more willing to sacrifice than others, to understand that means were subordinate to ends more so than their less self-actualized peers. We believe that Anwar al-Islam and his community of Bangshakil Upazia in Bangladesh displayed this characteristic on April 4th, 2016. The villagers of Bangshakali had been vocally protesting for several years the construction of a coal-powered power plant in the area, citing concerns about how it would devastate their water sources and their environment and ability to live in the area. And for about 2 years, these protests were met with silence until the people of Bangshakali organized and marched on the site where the plant was to be constructed. They were met with police opposition where they responded by chanting, "We will give away lives but not lands." The police opened fire, injuring 30 people and killing 4, including Anwar al-Islam Angor. The sentiment, "we will give away lives but not lands," rings of the ends over means sentiment that Maslow paints as characteristic of the self-actualized. Being willing to sacrifice oneself for a greater good, as was done by the people of Bangshakali, is as good of an example of valuing ends over means as anyone can give. For giving his life to embody the sentiment that he was killed chanting, we deem Anwar al-Islam Angor as self-actualized.
One of Maslow's traits of self-actualization is an air of detachment and a need for privacy. These individuals are not bound to their home or community as a sense of fulfillment, and that they can find that fulfillment in solitude. An individual we feel exemplifies this trait is Zabinzi Yakin, a ranger at the Virunga National Park. On January 23, 2016, Zabinzi Yakin was killed by poachers while patrolling the Virunga National Park in the Democratic Republic of Congo. As a ranger for the past 20 years, Yakin was aware of the risks he was going to face with these dangerous poachers. Yet, this was more than just a job to Yakin. It was about protecting his national heritage and preserving the land he loved so dearly. While he could have worked elsewhere to achieve similar goals, he loved this job because along with protecting the land, he enjoyed the solitude and agency that working as a ranger gave him. This relative independence being a ranger allowed him to grow and learn over his 20 years of service. This is why we believe Zabinzi Yakin is an example of Maslow's belief that self-actualized individuals have an air of detachment and a need for privacy. His life was not about fitting in societal norms or dependent on large social groups for reassurance. He found comfort in his own beliefs of bettering his nation and culture, and we believe this man presented self-actualized characteristics.
So, one characteristic that Maslow thought was universal, famed characteristic of self-actualized people, is a great wealth of creative energy. People who have reached self-actualization have a great drive to create artistically and to share their creations with other people. We believe that this trait is really well exemplified by wildlife filmmaker and conservation activist Joanne Root. Born in Nairobi in 1936, Joanne spent her life documenting and filming the local indigenous species of wildlife, and indeed one of her films actually was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 1978. Later in life, Joanne's passion turned from documentary filmmaking to wildlife conservation activism. She would personally chair and fund several anti-poaching task forces designed to enforce laws regarding illegal hunting and fishing in the area. Joanne's work started to earn her various death threats and attempted assaults and other forms of violence towards the end of her life, but despite this pressure, Joanne refused to leave. She was killed in Kenya on January 13th, 2006, 5 days before her 70th birthday, when 4 men forced their way into her home and shot her to death. These 4 men were taken into custody, where they later pled not guilty and were acquitted. The violence is considered to be a failed robbery, despite none of Joanne's possessions having been taken. Many believe her life was instead taken as part of a contract killing as retaliation for the work she had been doing to protect wildlife from local illegal poaching. And as per her wishes, her estate has since been turned into an admission-free wildlife preservation in Kenya. So when examining the life and work of Joanne Root, we feel that her life's work in wildlife filmmaking and activism is characteristic of what Maslow thought of as a self-actualized individual. We believe that the work she did as a creative and as an activist is a true indication of self-actualization.
Another one of Maslow's characteristics of self-actualization is a relative independence from their physical and social environment. They are not dependent on people or culture to bring them satisfaction, and they are not dependent on people or culture. They are not deficiency motivated; rather, they are growth motivated. We believe that Jose Claudio da Silva exemplified this trait as he worked against outside pressures to give up people's land to loggers and spoke out against these activities at length. Jose Claudio da Silva was a fiery spirited member of the CNS, or National Council of Extractive Populations, and a vocal leader for environmental concerns or project in his community. He and his wife, Maria do Espirito Santo de Silva, spoke out against land-hungry loggers ruining the lush vegetation in the rainforest of Brazil. He spoke at a TEDx conference with such passion regarding environmental activism in the Amazon, and denounced loggers and charcoal burners while referencing death threats he'd been receiving near daily. He's quoted to say, "I may be talking to you here today, and in a month you may hear news that I've disappeared. And I ask myself, am I scared? I am. I'm a human being. I get scared, but it doesn't make me shut my mouth. As long as I'm able to walk, I will be denouncing those who do harm to the forest." Zé Claudio had received multiple death threats prior to his murder. The Pastoral Land Commission, or CPT, even reported that his name was on the death list released in Para, Brazil, that directly threatened specific environmentalists for their activism. A short 6 months later, on May 24th, 2011, he and his wife were murdered, shot by assassins on motorbikes in their homeland, who then removed an ear from both of them, suspected purpose as proof of their death, and contributed widely to the theory that he and his wife's murder was an ordered hit. His death was also around the same time an amendment to the Forest Code of Brazil was being passed that would enable deforestation and potentially increasing the amount of slain forests in the Amazon, a number that's already been growing. Jose and Maria's legacies live on not only through their community, but in Jose's words spoken at his conference testimony. The forest is twice as sustainable when you leave it standing, because when you cut it down, you only have one chance, whereas when you leave it there, you will always have it. We believe that Claudio de Silva displayed the self-actualized characteristic of autonomy and independence. This is derived from de Silva's fervent actions against speaking out against the logging despite death threats. He would not stop his fight due to the threats from the loggers and remained steadfast in his goals. This to us is exemplary of autonomy and independence.
So this is the last of our eco-martyrs we're going to talk about, and the last of one of the characteristics, essentially one of the first people I researched, so I'm like super into her. So the self-actualized Maslow thought were characterized by, they were known for having a good sense of humor and their ability to find humor in dark, grim times and appreciate irony, maybe even a self-deprecating way. So with that in mind, let's examine the story of Sister Dorothy May Stang. Sister Dorothy was a nun who emigrated to Brazil in the 60s, where she learned of the struggles that the indigenous people there were facing, how their land was destroyed and their family members killed for the resources they live on. And she worked as part of her church there for about 10 years before denouncing them, saying that they weren't taking enough forward action to help the indigenous people there. And she then went out to live with the indigenous people in the forests of Brazil for the rest of her life. And she spent the rest of her life living with these indigenous people and helping them organize and advocate for themselves in nonviolent ways. And as her reputation for helping local communities grew, so did the violence against her. She would build community centers that were often defaced or burned down. She would suffer from frequent death threats. She was once arrested by the government for passing out subversive materials, here meaning the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in spite of all this, she kept fighting, saying, "I know they want to kill me, but I will not go away. My place is here alongside these people who are constantly humiliated by the powerful." Sister Dorothy had been working in Brazil for almost 50 years when she was confronted by two assassins on February 12, 2005. Witnesses say the assassins asked her, after holding her at gunpoint, "Do you have any weapons?" To which she responded, "Yes, I do," and pulled out her small King James Bible and proceeded to read them a verse for saying, "God bless you," to them. And they responded by shooting her to death. Over 2,000 people attended Sister Dorothy's funeral, and the assassins and the rancher who ordered Sister Dorothy's death were arrested and convicted 5 years later. So, when examining the last words and sentiments of Sister Dorothy, we believe that her humor in the face of death is highly characteristic of the sort of philosophical sense of humor that Maslow thought of as self-actualized. The ability to bring comedic value to one's final moments before being killed strike us as the exact sort of sense of humor that Maslow discusses when listing the traits of a self-actualized person. So to tie this back into Goldstein, the way this relates to our eco-miters might not be wholly apparent at first. And one of the Goldstein views of self-actualization is that it encompasses all life and all organisms, not just human beings. So when applying the term self-actualization in such broad strokes, it might be easy to ask what makes our eco-martyrs special. And we feel the simplest answer to this question is not only are eco-martyrs just as self-actualized as anyone else, they show an innate understanding of what self-actualization really is. They show invariance with how they view all life as being equal, not just human life. And they show that they understand the importance of holism, of meaningfully interacting with your environment. And they show that they understand these things as a sort of soul driving force. And furthermore, by sacrificing their lives in the protest and to protect their environment, they ensure the self-actualization of the environment as a whole can continue. A destruction of land leads to a destruction of self-actualizing organisms. And when our eco-martyrs die to protect the environment, they are sacrificing themselves to assure that the self-actualization of their environment can continue.
And into our exploration of self-actualization, we found a doctoral dissertation applying Maslow's concept of self-actualization onto a community scale. Entitled Community Development with Indigenous Communities, Facilitating the Creation of Appropriate Environments, Peter Douglas Briggs theorizes that community itself can reach a state of collective self-actualization, where each of its inhabitants play a role in fulfilling the hierarchy of needs. And if all the deficiency needs are fulfilled by community actions, it becomes a community in which self-actualization is more easily attained. And we believe the individuals we have highlighted throughout this discussion have not just fulfilled self-actualization, but have greatly contributed to the community level of actualization as well. While we haven't examined these communities through these eco-martyrs protected through this lens, we think it's worth posing the question, the level of our eco-martyrs have influenced these communities. All of our individuals we have found on our list through Global Witness have fought and died to protect the environment. Their dedication to protecting the environment directly contributes to the fundamental aspects of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as their physiological needs of air, food, water, and shelter are all directly tied to our environment. Without these individuals contributing to the betterment of the community, these communities may not have been able to grow as a collective and work to overcome the obstacles that environmental causes them. So, to wrap up a bit, throughout our investigation into the self-actualization of eco-martyrs, we've been humbled by the dedication these individuals have shown in protecting the environment. While many of these individuals may have considered themselves average or just doing what's right, we see a pattern in their behaviors that leads us to believe that they match with the Goldstein and Maslow views of self-actualization. And though these individuals may not have come from privileged backgrounds, or communities that inherently provide the basic needs that Maslow stated were needed for self-actualization, we believe these eco-martyrs have demonstrated a remarkable tenacity to overcome these obstacles in the name of protecting their environment.
Their actions are also in line with Goldstein's view of self-actualization, specifically the second aspect of his conceptualization of self-actualization in holism. These eco-martyrs understood that their existence required some level of meaningful interaction with their environment. And though they displayed this characteristic in this interaction with their environment differently, they all showed dedication to their environment in ways that also highlighted characteristics of Maslow's definition of self-actualization.
They exuded these characteristics through their environmentalism, and though they were killed for their efforts, these eco-martyrs had a lasting impact on their communities by doing what's right. We want to thank you for being here today and listening to our analysis, but also for allowing us to share the lives of a handful of the eco-martyrs that we've been researching for these past 18 months.
Aside from the psychological component of these individuals, we find it extremely important to share their stories. One of the best ways to stop history from repeating itself is through education, and it's easy to think of this list as a list of 1,600 horrible things that show how evil humanity can be, but when we talk about it like this, we like to think that it's also a way of looking at 1,600 cases of how great humanity can be. So we would like to stop now for a brief moment of silence in honor of our eco-martyrs in remembrance of everything they've done to protect their environment and their communities. And here are our citations.
Thank you you guys so much.
Any questions?
How do you guys